The reading today can be found on page 1172, and we are reading from Romans 2:12 to 16. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares.
Thank you so much. This morning, as Janice said, we continue our series. Actually not. Well, we continue because we've been coming through reasonable faith. We're doing it now. I'm not sure if we'll come to it again sometime this year, but we've been looking at some questions about Christianity, showing that our faith is not just a blind leap in the dark, but it's something that we can think through and wrestle with, reason through and trust. And I'm 26 right now, and I've gotten older. Of course, when I mentioned that, just because when I came to Christchurch, I was actually 21 years old. On the staff team. But as I've gotten older, I've started to notice how friendship dynamics have changed. Why I say this is not because I've had necessarily a lot of new friends, but the friends I have either have kids or recently have had a child. And this impacts how we spend our time together. All of a sudden we can't go till, I don't know, wee hours in the night, but we've got to think about a space that can be helpful and safe for kids as well. And as I've been spending time with these wonderful children, I've also got a niece who is 1 year old and a nephew who is 7. But as I've spent time with these kids, I've realized that something quite interesting about them. That there's the sense of a natural built-in sense of right and wrong. And I've seen that it shows up quite early. I've seen someone say, some child say, that's not fair, where another child gets a bigger slice of cake. Or saying, that's not fair because that's my toy, I don't want you to play with it. Or when someone is caught doing something they're not supposed to, like maybe drawing on a wall. Recently, my nephew, my sister has told me that he's broken a tile with a pipe-like object. And he waited for his mother to come home. And as she got home, he started crying because he knew he had done something wrong, even though no one had told him yet. And sometimes we see this little giggle or smile in kids when they've done something wrong. Because even though no one has told them they've done anything wrong, they feel the weight of their guilt and they know they've done something wrong. They just can't explain it yet. And psychologists have actually studied this, and they've said that even babies as young as 6 months old show signs of empathy, fairness, and judging good and bad behavior in others. In other words, there's something that is built within us, and we come with these moral instincts pre-installed. And that's where I'd like to begin today. Why do we all, from toddlers until we are grown up, have this inner voice that tells us what's right or wrong? Why do we feel guilty when we break it, even when no one's seen us do it? And so the question I'd like to ask you today is, how do you determine what's right and wrong? How do you base your moral judgment? Where does that inner sense of ought really come from? And you might be thinking, Lyall, why does this matter? See, because these questions are not just abstract questions that we should ask philosophers. They touch our real and they touch our daily life. Maybe you've got a family member or friend who's wrestling with doubt, asking, how do you truly know what's right and wrong? How can I truly say that God exists? Or maybe you felt the tension within yourself, wondering what anchors your sense of justice, compassion, or truth. And that's our topic today. That's what it's about. Looking at morality, but a moral argument for God. Now, in our passage today, we see that Paul is addressing the Jewish people, and we'll see he'll come to the Gentiles later, about God's impartial judgment. He makes it clear that God shows no favoritism. And in verses 12 to 15, Paul draws out another implication of that truth. And I believe Paul shares two warnings here in Romans 2, verses 12 to 16. First is for those who know the commands but fail to obey. Paul says that they will be judged by the law. In other words, it's dangerous to hear God's law and not live by it. After all, Paul reminds us in verse 13 that it's not those who hear the law are righteous in God's sight, but it's those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Then next we see Paul turns to another category. He looks at the Gentiles, who unlike the Jews did not grow up with the written law. Yet Paul says that some of them do by nature the things that are required by the law. In other words, even without growing up with the scriptures in front of them, their life sometimes reflects what the law demands. And why is that? Well, Paul says in verse 15, and we're going to look at this particular verse a few times. He says it's because the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciousness also bearing witness. This doesn't mean Gentiles are able to keep or uphold the law perfectly, or that they can find salvation outside of Christ. No, Paul makes it quite clear that salvation is only found in Jesus. Paul's point is not to say that the Gentiles can earn righteousness apart from Jesus, but what he's trying to tell us is that both Jews and Gentiles alike are accountable before God. Why? Because every single one of us carries within us the knowledge of the moral law. That takes us to our first scripture today, that God has written His law on every heart. But before we get lost in the word law, let's define it in a simpler way. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, points out that if two people quarrel, one isn't really saying, I dislike what you've done, but rather, what you've done is wrong, and you should have known better. This kind of argument, though, only makes sense if there is a standard of right and wrong to begin with, a moral law that exists outside of personal preference, one which both people instinctively recognize. Lewis calls this the law of human nature, or the law of right and wrong. And it's not about what he says, it's not about what you like versus what I like. It's about a shared sense of justice, fairness, and morality that transcends individual opinion. And the sociologist Christian Smith explains it in this way, and I found it quite helpful. He says, moral is an orientation toward understanding of what is right and wrong, just and unjust, that are not established by our own actual desires or preferences, but instead are believed to exist apart from them, providing standards by which our desires and preferences can themselves be judged. And so, in other words, he's saying morality is not invented by us, it judges us. And as we see, the sense of right and wrong is woven into our very instincts and emotions. Human beings are born with traits that naturally point to morality. Empathy, the ability to feel with others and feel what others are feeling. Guilt, the sense that wrongdoing matters. Shame, disgust, outrage, anger, when you see that unfairness is happening. And as I shared earlier, even babies show empathy, fairness, and the ability to judge goodness and badness in human behavior. These instincts don't explain morality away. They witness to the fact that there is a moral law that is written within us. And so there are some secular arguments that go against this, and some might argue that morality comes from evolution, that human beings simply evolved to feel a certain way. Others suggest morality is a social consensus, formed as societies grow and become more complex. Others claim that there's no obligation at all, that actually we are driven by our feelings. But if we examine all these carefully, we'll see that they fall short. That evolution can explain why we might have certain tendencies, for example, why we naturally empathize with others or feel guilt, but it cannot explain why we ought to act a certain way. Survival instincts do not generate a moral obligation. They do not tell us that stealing or lying or harming others is wrong, only that it can be detriment for our survival. And then social consensus explains what a group agrees is acceptable behavior, but it cannot create a standard that binds people across generations and cultures. If morality were only cultural, then atrocities in history could never be called wrong. Only that we've got different norms, that it's a different context, it's a different culture, which we see contradicts our deep intuition that some actions are objectively wrong. And personal preference can't account for moral obligation either. Just because I feel something is right, or I feel something is wrong, does not make it so. True moral obligation requires something beyond myself, something beyond society and beyond evolutionary survival. It requires a moral standard that transcends us all. And Tim Keller defines this really well when he defines moral obligation. He says moral obligation is a belief that some things ought not to be done, regardless of how a person feels about them within themselves, regardless of what the rest of their community or culture says, and regardless of whether it is in their self-interest or not. Our sense of right and wrong points us beyond evolution, social consensus, and personal preference. And this is exactly what Paul is pointing to in Romans 2, verses 14 to 15, where he says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. We show that the work of the law is written on our hearts, because our consciences bear witness against us. The conscience is not just a voice that tells us what is good, but it's also the prosecutor that points us to where we have fallen short. Now, seeing that morality exists in every heart, in Jews, Gentiles, believers, non-believers, naturally that raises a deeper question. If these moral standards are real and binding, where do they come from? If not evolution, social consensus, or personal preference, where do we get the answer from? Well, the answer points us beyond ourselves towards a source that explains why morality exists in the first place. And that's our second truth. That if there is a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. As we've seen that morality exists in every human heart, even in those who have never studied Scripture. Humans have an innate sense of right and wrong, a conscience that judges and accuses. But if morality is real and binding, there must be a source. There must be a lawgiver. Every law implies a lawgiver. And I feel that some of us might be really comfortable with this one because we know that traffic laws exist. Why? Because hopefully, not many of us, but I'm sure some of us have received a love letter before stating that those traffic laws exist. We see that games have rules because they were created. Someone made them, and morality is no different. Moral obligation, as we defined it earlier, exists because there must be a source beyond us. And C.S. Lewis captures this powerfully in Mere Christianity, where he argues that a moral law implies a moral lawgiver. If there is a universal moral standard that binds all people, it cannot simply come from within humanity. It must come from beyond us. And this is what Paul is pointing to, that our consciences bear witness. Something is accusing us and something is defending us. This is not random. It points to a standard outside of us, a higher authority to whom we are all accountable to. And think about this. When has an adulterer ever not known that he or she was betraying their spouse? When has a murderer ever not known that taking a life is wrong? We all know it. We all know it's wrong to cheat, to lie, to slander, or to covet, and that's because God has given us conscience. Right there in our hearts, God has written a set of what is right and wrong. And in Paul's time, in this context, in this Roman context, many of his readers would be familiar with some Greek philosophy. And the Stoics, for example, argue that the moral order we perceive comes from the Logos, a rational cosmic principle that structures the universe. They believe that humans could discern justice and injustice because morality is built into the very cosmos. In a way, Paul mirrors some of these reflections where he says that the Gentiles do the things that the law requires, even without them knowing the Mosaic law. But here's the limitation with this. Logos alone provides some really helpful structure, but not purpose. It explains what is right and wrong in the abstract, but not why we ought not to obey it, why we ought to obey it. Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher, pushes this point in his book, After Virtue. He argues that moral principles only make sense if they are tied to a transcendent telos, which is defined as a unifying purpose for human life. Without this, moral obligations collapse into fragments, arbitrary rules with no binding force. And at the heart of it, morality requires not just a cosmic order, but a personal lawgiver who provides both the standard and the purpose. God has planted the knowledge of Himself deep within our souls. Before you ever open a Bible, before you've taken your first breath, there is already an awareness of right and wrong because God has given us a moral compass and it is written into our conscience. Tim Keller wonderfully says in The Reason for God, he describes this as a signpost. Just as a compass needle always points north, our conscience points us to something that is beyond ourselves. It points us to the ultimate lawgiver. It not only reveals God's moral standards, but also our accountability before Him. And if this is true, then the one who sets the moral standard has to be of the highest good. The lawgiver must be perfectly good, otherwise why would morality exist at all? God grounds our moral obligations because His nature defines goodness. Because God is perfectly good, just and loving, God cares whether we fulfill these obligations. Our conscience, which is written by Him, calls us into relationship with Him and with others, revealing both our moral responsibility but also our ultimate purpose as humanity. And so now, having seen that God is the ultimate lawgiver and that our consciences point us to His moral standard, the question then arises, if the moral law is written on our hearts, how do we actually live out to it? How do we respond faithfully to the moral obligations that God has placed before us? Now remember when I was speaking about that word logos earlier, which pointed to that the Stoics believed there was a right and wrong, but without a personal lawgiver, they had no real power to how people actually obey it. Likewise, our consciences reveal that there is a God, and that there is God's standards, but they also reveal this tension. If we know what is right, why do we fail to do so? And this tension shows us something crucial. That our moral law doesn't just point to duty, it points to our deep need for God's grace. And that's our third truth, that the moral law reveals our need for grace. If we go look at one of the apostles, John, he starts his gospel by saying this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Now I'm going to try not to stumble over the word word, because when I say the word word means this, it can sound like I'm rapping for it. But the term word might seem odd at first. Like, John, why are you using the word? Could be that. But what John is talking about is Jesus. And so he's saying, in the beginning was God. In the beginning, was Jesus. He is God. He came into the world and we saw him. But why John called him the Word? We've got a little spoiler here. We see that in the original Greek, this word is translated into logos. Or the original Greek word is logos, and it's been translated into word. John is calling him the logos. This is a technical Greek philosophical term which we looked at earlier, which gives us a rational order behind the universe, moral absolutes to help us structure to structure the reality that we live in. But we see that Christianity takes it a step further. Because what our faith says is that Logos is not just an abstract set of standards, but the Logos is a person. It's Jesus. There is a moral obligation, yes, but it's not simply following abstract rules. The obligation is to know the Logos, to know Jesus, and that through knowing him, we connect with the heart of the universe and the purpose for which we were created. And here is the good news, that we are not saved by our ability to perfectly follow moral standards. We are saved by the Logos coming to earth in flesh, taking our place, dying on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins, and through that we are given the free gift of grace. He died for you, he died for me to cover all of our wrongdoings so that we can live by grace and importantly live in freedom. And this is the beauty that we've got in Jesus. This is what sets our faith apart. The grace that we receive, it's not abstract, it's not a theory, it's real and it's tangible. And it is extended to all of us today. Whether you have kept your moral obligations or whether you have failed miserably, God's grace is wide enough to cover you. And this is why morality as an argument for God is so powerful. Because it doesn't just prove that God exists, yes, that's important, but what it does is it guides us to God's grace. That the moral law is written in our hearts. It shows us that there is a lawgiver, yes, but more than that, it shows us our deep need for him. And in Jesus, we find that the Logos is not just the lawgiver, but also our Savior. And at the end of the day, morality is not just about proving a point. It's about pointing us to a person, and his name is Jesus. In conclusion, C.S. Lewis once said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because I see everything else. When you come to know Jesus, the Logos, it's as if a light is being switched on. Morality, meaning, and purpose come into focus because you are walking in His truth. And so as we close, I'd like you to pause, to listen. Maybe this morning we need to listen to the voice of our conscience, where Paul says that it bears witness within us. For some of us, that voice may be heavy with guilt or regret. For some of us, that voice has been covered with shame. For others this morning, it's a reminder of our need for grace. And the good news is wherever you are at, His grace is exactly what Jesus offers us. And so this morning, as we were praying, someone spoke about rest, and someone else mentioned the passage in Matthew 11 where it says, come all weary, come all you burdened, and I will give you rest. And I love that invitation because what Jesus is saying, come, I'll give you freedom. It points to the cross saying, I will take on your burdens. I will give you the free gift of my salvation, and I will cover you with grace. Now live in freedom. Paul's message throughout Romans was clear. We cannot live up to the law by ourselves, but we don't have to because we've got Jesus. Christ has done it for us, so we can come to Him and receive His grace. This morning I'd like to encourage us to be free, to now live in that freedom. Yes, for some of us, a lot of this might be helpful because there might be some friends who are struggling with this topic or some family that is struggling. And if you're in that position, I'd like you to come up and receive some prayer. And maybe there's some wrestling within yourself this morning as well. Maybe there's been guilt and shame that is covering you. And Jesus welcomes you this morning to come up front and be free.